is wonderful to welcome Professor Justin E.H. Smith of the University of Paris once again.
I I've changed my name.
Oh, really?
Yeah, my name is Justin Smith-Ruiu with a
Oh,
hyphen. Yeah.
okay.
So I added my spouse's name and because it's an uncommon name, I don't need the middle initials anymore. So I'm no longer Justin E.H. Smith. I'm Justin Smith-Ruiu.
Okay. I'll make a note of
Mm.
that. So, Justin Smith-Ruiu, the podcast, formerly known as Justin E.H. Smith, of course. He teaches philosophy at the University of Paris. And as we met on this podcast last year,
Mhm.
and we are meeting again this year to discuss another essay which you wrote in Liberties.
Yeah.
Yes, I believe last year we talked about the internet, and that was
Hmm.
a wonderful discussion. You wrote a
Hmm.
very small book on that, which
Hmm.
I would encourage everyone to read. Right now, we're talking about the essay, The Happiness Industrial Complex. It
Hmm.
was
Hmm.
published in the winter 2023 issue of Liberty's Journal, one that I
That's
read
right.
with much frequency. And
Hmm.
without further ado, welcome Justin
Thanks.
Smith-Ruiu for joining the
Thanks
show.
so much. Yeah, thanks for having me again. Hmm.
Okay, so let's begin by me asking you a simple but broad question.
Hmm.
What or how would you define happiness?
Oh goodness, that's not a simple question. I can begin by saying that there are several candidates for a definition that classically get brought up when we're teaching, uh, say, the philosophy of happiness. I don't know if there is such a thing as a subdiscipline, but as a part of moral philosophy or maybe, of course, an ancient philosophy. Um, and I think the two primary competing definitions are, um, let's say, eudaimonia versus pleasure. That is to say, the latter are people who think that happiness is wrapped up in, let's say, units of pleasure. Um, Orgasms or delicious food or roller coaster rides or whatever. The list is long. And the eudaimonists, by contrast, are those who think that if you have such a conception of happiness, and you go out and you seek to maximize the amount of pleasure in your life, it's safe to say you're going to end up pretty unhappy, right? Like, let's say I just want to get as much pleasure as I can, so I'm just going to start, doing all the drugs I can find and, drinking all the heavy cream I can find or whatever else. I'm going to be pretty miserable pretty quick, right? So that's almost a demonstration that pleasure can't be simply identical with happiness. So what's the alternative? What is eudaimonia? Well, literally, it's the condition of having good demons inside of you, right? Where a daimon, that's where we get the word demon, but the truth is in Greek, it doesn't mean demon, like, or at least in pagan Greek, pre-Christian Greek, it doesn't mean, someone with a pitchfork and horns or something like that. It means something like good spirits. And in fact, colloquially in English, to say I'm in good spirits is a pretty close thing to saying I'm happy, right? So eudaimonia is literally the condition of having good spirits, but it is something that most of its defenders, particularly in the Hellenistic period of philosophy, after, let's say, Greek philosophy, after Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, the idea is that you obtain or you arrive in a condition of eudaimonia by not by accumulating a maximum of pleasure, or making the pleasure scale go as high as possible, but rather by something more long term and arduous, which for the Stoics, for example, is learning not to depend on externals, that is, including not just, wealth and fancy cars and the stock market going up, all the things you can't control, but even includes your family. For a Stoic, if your beloved family members die, you're supposed to be like, oh well, I can do just as well without them. You lose an eye, and you're supposed to say, oh well, one eye is just as good as two, as far as I'm concerned, and it's pretty extreme. For someone like Aristotle, by contrast, it's wrapped up in the cultivation of virtuous character, right? Which probably involves foregoing a lot of pleasure over the course of your life, though probably not as much pleasure as the Stoics would have to forego. And one more point about oh yeah, the common phrase, and I'll quit the Greeks soon enough. It wasn't my purpose to talk about the Greeks today, but the common phrase that circulated among a wide variety of Greek authors that we still cite very often today without really thinking about what it means is call no man happy till he dies, right? And the idea there is not that dying is fun or that being dead is fun or pleasurable, but rather that the question of whether you are happy or not is something that's settled only when nothing more can go wrong in your life, right? And things can go wrong up until the moment you're dead. And in happiness, as is implied by that saying, is not something like an internal feeling that a living person has, but rather an objective attribute that can be extended even to a dead person, right? And just one more point about this, etymologically, in English, the word happy is in its older sense, we still have fixed expressions like happy circumstances, right? Or even, common terms like happenstance and things like this that all suggest something more like chance or hazard or fortune. And I guess fortune also straddles the boundary between these two notions, right? On the one hand, feeling good, but on the other hand, things working out well for you. Right, whether you even know it or not, you could be in a coma and still be fortunate because because the people consider you heroic or valorous or whatever, right? So I don't believe any of these. I'm just summarizing them to kind of prepare the ground, and to suggest that the self-help industry of the 21st century is working with a fairly etiolated conception of happiness when it takes for granted that happiness is an enduring, more or less predominant inner feeling of goodness or something like that. That's not the only option, and indeed, it's not at all a settled matter in the history of philosophy and of reflection on these sorts of questions, whether a life spent feeling good most of the time, just having a kind of pleasant buzz most of the time, uh, is a good life to lead. There are arguments, there are thinkers who would propose, by contrast, that no, the best life to lead is an arduous and difficult one, right? And one that doesn't that doesn't carry that buzz with it, right? So the question is very complicated, historically and conceptually, and I don't know what happiness is.
Okay, well, that's a wonderful answer. I guess my next question will be the flip side to my previous one, and that is how would you define unhappiness?
Uh, well, um, I don't think I can for the same reasons that I can't define happiness. But to me, unhappiness sounds, or the adjective, let's take the adjective unhappy. For some reason it sounds very close to unfortunate, and there, as in phrases like an unfortunate sequence of events, again we have that connotation, not of the absence of pleasant of a pleasant buzz necessarily, but rather just uh, chance or fortune or hazard not working out in the way that that one might have preferred. Um, Now, that's obviously not what we mean when we go to the psychiatrist and we say, I'm always unhappy, I need some pills or something like that. Um, and I think one of the big questions that preoccupies me in writing about this and thinking about this, as someone who, as I've confessed in the article, I have gone to the psychiatrist and asked for some pills, um, because, as I mean, I obviously, if I go to a psychiatrist and I'm paying 110 euros for a 50-minute session, I'm not going to discourse upon the ancients on eudaimonia or something like that. I'm just going to go in there and say, I'm unhappy. I need to fix this, right? And I take it for granted that when I say that, I'm operating according to our standard cultural conception of what unhappiness is. Um, but when I get back from the psychiatrist's office and I start thinking again and remember that I've read Aristotle and the Stoics and the Epicureans and so on, then it starts to seem to me again that word I just used in the psychiatrist's office is not at all clear any more than the word happy is. But it seems to me that, so what I wanted to say was that for me, uh, the big kind of question, and here I follow the great philosopher Ian Hacking, um, in the kind of vein of what he called historical ontology, obviously feeling bad enough to go to the psychiatrist is something real. Nonetheless, that something real is uh, conceptualized and articulated in culturally and historically contingent and ultimately fleeting vocabulary, right? And so then the big philosophical question for me that I've already alluded to is, what is real in this feeling? And are there other conceptual resources for thinking about it, like Hellenistic ethics, for example? And could these other conceptual resources, coming to me from other thought worlds, maybe make me happier, right? Even if I have trouble defining what that is.
Oh yeah. I suppose literary wise, I think the best depiction of unhappiness can be found in the works of Saul Bellow. Um,
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Hmm.
um, of course, his greatest work is Herzog, but
Hmm.
recently I also read his the book that he authored sometime after that, Mr. Sandler's Planet.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've
That,
read Mr. Samler's Planet years ago. I
Mhm.
have to say, just because of the shortness of life, I have not really engaged with the works of Saul Bellow. He's one of the authors who's not on my list. I don't want to say of faves. I don't dislike him. He's just someone I'm not terribly familiar with. So tell me more.
Okay. So I the trouble with Bellow is that not many of his novels, perhaps not any of them, are adaptable into other mediums, say movies.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so um, at least the novels that I'm familiar with the
Hmm.
most, Herzog and Sandler, they are essentially long drawn out inner monologues from
Hmm.
the main
Hmm.
character, either Moses Herzog or Arthur Sandler.
Hmm.
Um, they try to pin down what is the source of unhappiness in modern life.
Hmm.
And at least from my reading of it in both Herzog and Sandler, the answer is that modern life offers no answer to the question of either why be happy or how to be happy or
Yeah.
so on and so on.
Hmm.
Like you said, when I asked you what happiness is, you refer to the classical era philosophers.
Yeah. Hmm. Hmm.
And I I detect that in the modern era, the question of happiness is
Hmm.
not so often raised.
Yeah.
Of course, in
Yeah.
the American Declaration of Independence, there's
Hmm.
the clause that says the pursuit of happiness.
Hmm.
But most American political discourse, at least the one that I find bearable enough to tune into,
Hmm.
um, the question of human happiness does not arise.
Yeah. Well, I would say, and this is kind of off the cuff, but in the American Declaration of Independence, the emphasis, the implicit um, idea of happiness at work there is that it's up to each of us to determine what happiness is for ourselves, right? So that's maybe a corollary of the emphasis placed on freedom, right? It's up to you're free, and that's good news. But hold on a second, it's going to be tough because you're the one who has to determine what your happiness is going to be, right? And in a sense, that problem, the kind of horror vacui that comes along with freedom gets fully articulated in the 20th century by schools of philosophy like the existentialists, right? But arguably, already in the 18th century, you could say they should have seen it coming.
Mhm. Yes. Speaking of the existentialists, I remember it was last year around the time that I had that conversation with you, maybe like it
Hmm.
would take a month before or after.
Hmm.
I was in a terrible state of life.
Oh.
I believe I was in Austria at the
Hmm.
time, and nothing worked out for me. I'm in another country now, Hungary, Budapest.
Yeah.
Things seem to be working out for me
Good.
finally, so I appreciate that.
Hmm.
But I remember reading the pages of Being in Time by Heidegger.
Hmm. Hmm.
And to this day, I don't think I can tell you what that book was about. But
Hmm.
but as I read that book, the process of reading it, the process of trying to understand what that book is about, brought me a brief sense um, of I guess the word is comfort.
Hmm.
One can say
Hmm.
temporary happiness or a temporary distraction from the unhappiness
Hmm.
that surrounded me at
Hmm.
that time.
Hmm.
So it's it's a strange experience, and
Yeah.
it is one that I find particularly memorable. So I wonder if
Interesting.
that's
Being in
something.
time, being in time makes me anxious, to be honest. I mean, a lot of it is about anxiety, right?
Yeah.
Angst. But maybe it's primarily because Heidegger likes so much that particular example of a mood and its world disclosing power, right? That I maybe take him up on the thought experiment and I'm like, okay, let's see how anxiety discloses the world. And indeed it does. And that's something I've actually been thinking about a lot. And I've been kind of thinking back to Heidegger, whom I haven't read in some years now, um, in the depths of great anxiety or depression, um, one can feel like a world is being disclosed to one, right? That is to say, that one is not so much uh, failing to apprehend the world as it is, but rather seeing, on the contrary, seeing the world with utmost lucidity. And it seems to have this power, that is, severe anxiety seems to have this power to reveal something like the truth. Again, the truth in Heidegger's highfalutin sense of disconcealment, right? And that's very scary and miserable when one is going through it. But it also seems somehow valuable and maybe necessary in the course of a human life. If you never experienced severe anxiety, you never felt that sort of lucidity, you never felt the ties that bind coming unraveled, that might not be a life spent in a way that's fully examined, right? Um,
Yeah.
Not that I recommend anxiety.
Yeah. My first introduction to philosophy as a discipline was through the existentialists of the 19th and 20th century.
Hmm.
Um, Nietzsche and Camus and Sartre and such.
Hmm.
Of course, I guess my teenage, so to speak, infatuation with their ideas fade away as I become an adult and I begin to see the cracks in their thinking, so to speak.
Hmm. Hmm.
But in many ways, I cherish their gift of philosophical thinking
Hmm.
to me, the
Hmm.
14, 15-year-old Jung Win. Um,
Hmm.
and I cherish the fact that they understand with a great deal of clarity the ambiguousness of
Yeah.
what happiness is or what meaning
Hmm.
is. And that brings me to your criticism of persons like Arthur C. Brooks
Hmm.
and the self-help authors of his
Hmm.
variety. And I
Hmm.
wonder, is your main contention with Brooks and Co. stems from the fact that they offer too easy answers or that their answers
Hmm.
are mistaken?
Well, I suppose they're not mistaken in I think they're true enough, true as far as it goes. And there are practical steps a person can take to feel better on a day-to-day basis. In fact, the truth is, as I get older in my life, I become more self-helpy, in ways that actually surprise me, be good to yourself, make space for yourself, be sure, don't forget self-care and stuff like that, things that I just mocked and rolled my eyes at 10 years ago. I'm like, yeah, well, yeah, maybe that's good advice. Um, but I suppose what's missing is, what Unamuno calls the tragic sense of life, right? The any acknowledgement that we finite mortal beings might just be stuck in a condition where we cannot self-help our way out of the the worries and the problems and the feelings of discontentment that haunt us. And in a way, it's more rewarding to kind of face up to these limitations, to look into the void, so to speak, rather than to pretend. And then once you accept that, then it's pretty obvious that the problem with self-help is not that what any of these characters like Arthur C. Brooks are saying is false. It's just that it's incomplete. It doesn't give you a complete picture of a human life. And the reason for this pretty obviously comes across as marketing, as you don't want to harsh the mellow of the self-help shelves at Barnes and Noble, right? That's against their marketing strategy. That's not part of their kind of graphic design feel, right? And so the reason we have this impoverished genre, um, in contrast with I mean, in a sense, if you look at Epictetus or Spinoza, those are also self-help authors, right? In a sense, I mean, they're great philosophers, but they're also self-help authors, properly understood. But they're looking at the whole picture and recognizing our limitations in a way that is against the economic incentives of the authors who end up on the self-help section rather than in the philosophy section in a 21st century Barnes and Noble. Though I have to say, the philosophy section in a 21st century Barnes and Noble is pretty shabby itself, right? And it's not as if that's much better. What are you going to get there? You're going to get Bertrand Russell's autobiography and a bunch of Simpsons and philosophy type anthologies that are pretty worthless, and maybe another. But I won't complain about that. In any case, the self-help section is not worth visiting at all. The philosophy section might be worth visiting to see if any of my books showed up there. Just kidding.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned Spinoza earlier.
Mm,
He's one of my favorites also. And I've as I do my studies in philosophy, I've come to realize that some of my favorite philosophers are not necessarily the ones whose ideas that I agree with, but the
mhm,
ones whose during the experience of reading them, I find um, the most I suppose intellectually edifying.
mhm, mhm.
So it
Sure.
even goes to those that I pretty much disagree with too.
Mhm.
Heidegger being one of them.
Sure.
Um, but Spinoza, I think, from my reading of him, he seems to follow this pretty stoic path of what it means to
Mhm.
live an ethical life.
Yeah.
Don't I believe it was it was in the second chapter, so to speak, the second part where he says, well, it is not wise to be upset or angry at someone says uh, when someone wrongs you, so to speak, when someone
Mhm.
trespasses upon you, because um, well, given the circumstances of his or her birth and also his or her upbringing and his or her character, then it is natural that he or she will act that way. And if you happen to be, the unfortunate recipient of a wrongful action, then
Mhm.
you know, um, you're not supposed to be too much fussy about it. And
Mhm.
I take that as something quite meaningful, because
Mhm.
I have it's a bad habit, but I keep a record of things that people have done to me that
Mhm.
I find to be displeasing at times.
Mhm. hmm
and I still do, but I find myself as I think about Spinoza's injunction more and more,
hmm
I wake up each and every day not thinking about the
hmm
things that have been that people do that I find to be
hmm
wrong, either
hmm
towards
hmm
me or towards the concept
hmm
of ethics in general. So
Sure.
tell me more about how Spinoza
Well,
I guess.
actually, I mean, Spinoza, yeah, Spinoza's relationship to the Stoics is pretty complicated, but we can at least recognize a harmony with the Stoic and more broadly Hellenistic idea that in order really to be happy, you've got to start with ontology and physics and logic and so on. Um, that is to say that, we pick up this weird book called Ethics, or more precisely, Ethics Demonstrated in the Geometrical Fashion. And we think, oh, good, I want to learn about ethics. That's important. And then you read the first several parts, and he's talking about, how. There can only be one substance, and it has infinitely many attributes, and so on. And you're just like this isn't ethics. Why is he talking about this extremely abstract, high level stuff? And the answer is, as for the Stoics, who also had, a pretty elaborate theory of how the natural world works. If you have false beliefs about the world, then you're going to consistently feel affronted when the world doesn't operate according to your expectations, right? And in that respect, um, I think most of the history of philosophy prior to the 18th century was actually uh, of the same sort. I want to be happy. What do I have to do first in order to get there? Well, you've got to figure out how bodies in the external world stay in motion. You've got to figure out if God is the first cause, and all of this stuff that no self-help author today would ever dream of touching, right? You've got to do all of that propedeutic work because believing in a providential universe, at least for Spinoza, is setting yourself up for constant disappointment. Now, I happen to be a non-Spinozist. I wouldn't say an anti-Spinozist. That's a bit strong. I admire him a great deal. But I happen to think that there are ways of uh, preserving some idea of providence, and not being a superstitious sucker who's setting yourself up for disappointment. I won't go into that, but it always surprises me today how reflexively Spinozist most of my peers in philosophy are. Everyone just takes it for granted that that guy got it right. I don't want to say everyone, but many people. I'm more of a Leibnizian about questions of providence and teleology, but that's another topic.
Mhm. Now, the the essay of yours ends with
Hmm.
this. Sorry, I need to find that. All right. We know that happiness, and I quote here, is not the sort of thing that can be bought or sold. And we know, I now feel emboldened to say that we, the unhappy, are its true experts.
Oh
Um,
yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
so
Hmm.
that sort of makes me think of there are times when I would be at a social setting when I would find that someone is like almost unnaturally exuberant almost all the
Hmm.
time,
Hmm.
and he or she would be the kind like the source of joy and happiness that everyone wants to be
Hmm.
around him or her. And over time, I find that kind of person. I'm skeptical about those
Yeah.
kinds of people. Like
Yeah.
it at first it was like there's not that much in the world to be happy about, but
Mm.
um, but now I find that there there are certain types of people who projects joy and
Hmm.
happiness in the public
Hmm.
setting while themselves in the private setting are well quite miserable. I think
Yeah.
like, Robin Williams, for example,
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
thought that it is obviously it's not better to project misery onto others,
Mm.
but
Yeah.
rather to project a sort of calm and collected
Yeah.
demeanor. I
Yeah.
think
Certainly.
that is
Yeah.
more convincing as an example of happiness.
Yeah, Robin Williams is a lovely example. I mean, indeed, there's a striking connection between sharp sense of humor and some kind of internal suffering. It's not a law or even necessarily a rule or a regularity, but we're familiar with that type of person. And at the same time, I think, I've often noticed that the people who are probably most content in life are people who it's pretty hard to get a reaction out of, are just kind of in a kind of calm homeostasis and who, to be frank, strike me as dull. And then, when I meet someone who makes me laugh, I'm like, wow, here's someone who's cracked like I am, and it's like a sense that like uh, a fellow spirit, someone I can relate to, is someone who is socially very, let's say, verbose and maybe a bit offensive and very funny, but also gives little hints that they're really suffering. So yeah, that's familiar. But I would also say, one thing that I often think about is what a waste of time it is when commentators on criminal trials talk about the expression on the defendant's face. Like the defendant looked like he was far too at peace when the guilty verdict was being read. Uh, or the defendant showed sufficient remorse or insufficient remorse. Like you have no idea what the hell's going on in that person's mind. I mean, if I were declared guilty and sentenced to life in prison, I have no idea what kind of expression would be on my face at that particular moment. But what I can say is that the expression on my face probably wouldn't be telling the whole story of what's going on inside me, right? And so when I think about that, I just think we have no business trying to infer what's going on inside of other people by such things as facial expression or the like, you know
Mhm,
or demeanor or social demeanor in general.
mhm. Yeah. So regarding Stoicism, there is like as I familiarize myself with the works of the classical era Stoic thinkers
Hmm.
and also the modern commentators like Ryan Holiday, for example,
Hmm.
I find that although there are certain takeaways that I think are very much valuable, overall the entire Stoic paradigm is not one that I'm all too willing to accept
Yeah. It,
because
it's a yeah, yeah, it's a pretty tall order.
Mhm.
I think actually Martha Nussbaum
Yeah.
has a very nice passing criticism of the Stoic doctrine of independence from externals in her book, The Therapy of Desire. And I can't paraphrase it accurately. It's been a long time since I read that book, but you know, when Epictetus counsels that you should think of your children the way you think of like shiny seashells and baubles when you're on a voyage on a ship and the captain lets you get, you anchor at shore and you go ashore and you walk on the beach for an hour. Then when the captain calls you back, you throw the shiny seashells back in the sand and you return to your ship and take off. Those shiny seashells are supposed to be the analog of your children. And what Nussbaum says is something like, look, anyone who would be that kind of uh, static, be able to maintain equanimity through the death of their own children is probably not happy, right? Is probably cracked in some other way that is going to foil their life plans sooner or later, right? So that is to say, it's a pretty superficial psychology that Stoicism offers. And again, maybe Stoicism is the closest to 21st century self-help because it refuses, again, to cite Unamuno, it refuses again to recognize our tragic condition, right? You might very well depend for your happiness on the continued existence of your loved ones. And if a Stoic tries to convince you that that's like a mistake, like a conceptual mistake, because happiness must be something that doesn't depend on external circumstances enduring indefinitely into the future. You just have to say, look, I'm sorry, but that's the human condition. And it means that many of us will indeed end up happy when unhappy when tragedy strikes.
Yes. Now, regarding the human condition, so to speak, I'm very much reminded of obviously the first tragedy that launched the Judeo-Christian narrative that
Hmm.
the Western world has familiarized itself. The one that starts with Adam and Eve being
Mm-hmm.
banished from the garden. And for me, at least, it strikes a powerful note in that
Mm-hmm.
if given happiness, we as humans, like our ancestors, Adam and Eve, would likely squander it. Uh,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so,
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
and yeah.
Yeah, and you're right to identify the fall as tragedy indeed, even in the Greek sense, in the Sophoclean sense, it's a fall resulting from an oversight or let's say a blind spot, maybe not on Eve's part, but on Adam's part, because he trusts Eve in this connection, and we could say a lot about the possible misogyny packed into this story, but we can skip that. In any case, um, the indeed, I hadn't really thought about it as, uh, uh, containing the moral lesson that even if we were given happiness as a gift, we would squander it. We would squander it again. Um, but I think there are countless possible interpretations of the significance of the tale, and that's certainly a good one. I personally find the doctrine of original sin quite appealing. I mean, I think it's it's a it's a more powerful account of why I feel so rotten than say that my serotonin is being what's the term, reuptaken too quickly or something, right? Somehow, if we have to weigh those two against one another, I'm going to say neither tells the full story, but the story in terms of brain chemistry definitely doesn't.
Mhm. Yeah. This was pointed out to me yesterday by my younger brother in that
Mhm,
in Paradise Lost. I think it was in book nine. Obviously in the biblical narrative, there was a gap of time between Eve eating off of the fruit and Adam eating off of fruit
mhm,
at the behest of Eve.
mhm,
Milton wrote that story or imagined that story as if Adam, out of love for Eve, willing to
mm. That's right, yeah.
sacrifice his salvation for her,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
is, I think,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'd forgotten that. You're right, though. Yeah. 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 Again, there are indefinitely many possible retellings or new spins on what Genesis itself gives us. Yeah.
And from that particular reading, which is still I'm still like wrapping my head around it, it sort of occurred to me what I know to be true, and what I find to be lacking in either the Stoic ideal, which I've read, and the Buddhist ideal, which I grew up with as a
Hmm.
Vietnamese.
Hmm.
There's a conception of happiness as self-fulfillment, which
Hmm.
you do what you can to be the best version of yourself, which it's all well and good, but
Hmm.
uh, um true happiness, or the kind of happiness that is truly fulfilling, is stems from some version of self-abnegation, where
Yeah.
you do certain things in order to benefit the lives of others.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
this is a quotation by the Indian mystic poet Rabindranath Tagore.
Hmm. Oh, yeah,
He
sure. Yeah.
says that a man who plants a tree knowing full well that which shade he will never sit under understands the meaning of life. So
Yeah.
I pass it on to
Yeah.
you. What do you think of that?
Here's something that comes back to me quite frequently, and this is in part kind of a consequence of my recent return after several decades to Catholicism, which I had in my childhood and then forgot about for the bulk of my life and rediscovered really just last year. And it's slow and gradual, and I have lots of questions and good spiritual guides. But one thing that really strikes me and puzzles me is that I see no greater e expression of happiness than in, say, the insouciance of children, right? Who are typically very selfish. When I mean, if I see it in teenagers, I also see it in toddlers. Toddlers are extremely self-centered and, only want to be, to take as many toys or as much candy or whatever for themselves as they can. And, St. Augustine would say that that's already sinful. I see it and I think, "Eh, how joyful," and so I don't quite know what to do with that. And then, like, let me just say also that I fluctuate between periods of calm insouciance where I'm, like everybody else, I don't know, happy that I got a new pair of shoes or something like that. And I think I look cool or whatever, and I forget all about my fellow man and my duties before God and so on. And I'm just like, my shoes are shiny and cool. And uh, uh, in turn, it's in the moments of greater despondency that I remember, oh yeah, it's my duty to to serve others and to be as good to others as I can, because that's the way one approximates the love of God on earth, and so on and so forth. Um, and it's puzzling, again, it's puzzling and troubling to me that that my calmest and in some sense happiest moments are the ones where I'm being a foolish, selfish toddler. And in turn, my most, I think, moral moments, the moments where I'm coming good on what it is to be a human being or to have human potential, are the moments where I'm triggered by despondency, right? That's really, it's supposed to be the other way around. And maybe it's just because I'm still working at it. But I think there's a larger problem, and Augustine talks about this, not in a satisfactory way, or not in a conclusive way, to in my view. There's a larger problem where if you're a Christian, you're not supposed to hate the world. You're not supposed, I mean, that's more like, the Albigensian heresy or some form of Gnosticism. The world is God's creation and it's filled with goodness and you're supposed to love it and so on. But loving the world uh, in a way that reflects its greatness as the work of creation, and loving the world in a sinful, forgetful way, I think the line between those two is very easy to slip back and forth across, as I think comes through in this example of the shoes. I mean, is there something wrong with a person who's beaming with happiness because they like the new shoes they've just gotten? Ordinarily, we'd say no, but watch out, right? Anyhow, I spend a lot of time thinking about this, and just to get back to the point about the Buddhist monk, I mean, I do wonder whether the most kind of uh, elevated, advanced, enlightened monk in the world also gets a little kick when he gets a new pair of sandals or whatever. And of course, we have the example of, like, Saint Anthony and the church fathers out in the desert. But as far as we can tell, they were, the stylites on top of pillars, starving themselves and exposing themselves to death. I mean, that's one way of being devout, but as far as we can tell, they were pretty miserable. They were pretty unhappy. And maybe that unhappiness was so extreme that at times it lapsed over into ecstasy, right? And that has something akin to happiness in it. But for the most part, we can't all be St. Anthony's, and I don't think there's any religion that expects us to be. So we're stuck in a world where we, do our best not to be selfish toddlers our whole lives, but also to continue to enjoy getting a new pair of shoes or eating a nice meal or whatever. And so, I'm still working this out for myself. I should have worked it out by now at this age, but it's still a puzzle to me.
So, I suppose this can be a good note to end on. One of the books I recently finished is The Seven-Story Mountain, Thomas Merton.
Uh-huh. Oh yeah, sure.
Wonderful
Yeah.
book. I
hmm
think it's a book for like every generation to read. Um,
Sure.
and I'm very much fortunate to read it around like the age that I am now. I'm
Hmm.
24 because
Hmm.
at 23, Merton uh, chose the path of the monastery. Uh,
Hmm.
he chose the monastic life,
Yeah, yeah,
and I find that it is and it's remarkable. It brings me back to that example of war renunciation or self
hmm,
renunciation
yeah,
that can provide the path to happiness.
hmm,
Um,
hmm,
now, um, I think you and I both read in the news about like the rise of mental health troubles among young people.
yeah,
Um, I think whenever I read certain phenomena on the news, I would assume that it is exaggerated in some way, shape, or
yeah,
form. It may be true, but again, if it is a news item, it's some exaggeration is
hmm,
has played into it. But it is
hmm,
true that in my own life as well as I as I interact with my fellow peers at the university setting, mental health troubles are quite common, or at least are commonly discussed. And the
yeah,
commonality
yeah,
of my peers is that they come from quite comfortable or if not affluent families. And
hmm,
they are all active in like the political sense in that they support causes that I find, I have like plenty of reservations about, like,
hmm,
social justice,
hmm,
climate
hmm,
change, and the environment, all that. I suppose that it is in some ways that they are trying to pursue that path of I guess self-abnegation that Merton did,
yeah,
but the
yeah,
outlet in which
yeah,
they are pursuing may not be the most healthy for either them or
yeah. Well,
political discourse as a whole. So
mm,
yeah, I would expect
yeah.
them to. What do you think of it?
That's a whole cluster of issues there. The current mental health crisis and its connection to new technologies, the relationship between political engagement and self-fulfillment. I mean, I would say that many, say, Twitter activists, however you want to describe them, are not at all on the path of self-abnegation. They're on the path of self-aggrandizement, and they're, riding the vehicle of this or that cause in order to get there. Or maybe there's a mixture of both sincere engagement and, perfectly natural desire to rise in the hierarchy of prominence among activists, right? Um, so, but whatever the case is, I think the evidence is pretty conclusive that there is a real connection between new communication technologies and mental health problems. And there's no reason we should be surprised by that because these technologies are fine-tuned to work on the dopamine reward system. And that effectively addicts us to likes or whatever. And you know, I am 51 years old, and if I post something, well, I don't have social media anymore except Substack. If I post something on Substack and only three people put a little heart, I end up thinking, oh no, I'm so stupid and worthless. I should just crawl into a hole. And if I'm doing that, then, I can't imagine how much more powerful that negative experience is for a 13-year-old, you know, because I had a sense of who I am already long before social media learned how to exploit my limbic system, right? A 13-year-old had no opportunity to develop that sense of self. So it's terrible. And it should be, I don't know. I don't know what the solution is. But I hope someone else will propose one.
Yes, I understand that. Professor Jonathan Haidt of NYU is
Yeah.
jumping on this train.
Hmm.
His findings have been interesting so far.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw his piece on, the kind of the raw numbers on uh adolescent mental health from 2012 to today, and it is really, really striking. Now, of course, as a Hackingian, that is someone who appreciates the work of Ian Hacking in the domain of historical ontology, I always want to, so to speak, control for how much can be explained simply by uh, changes in the way we talk about things, right? And you might say the same thing about political extremism. Are people more politically extreme in the 2020s than in the 1980s? Well, I remember people I was around in the 1980s saying some really shocking things that would get them canceled online, but there was no online. So they didn't get canceled, and they didn't, they were just, local idiots. And similarly with mental health, one does have to ask to what extent the crisis is discursively produced, an artifact of discourse, right? Uh, uh, and if it's an artifact of discourse, does that mean that the actual kind of measure of misery in the 2020s is not actually higher than it was, say, in the 1980s, right? I mean, medieval or Paleolithic 13-year-olds were often probably not exactly happy either. They had to deal with all sorts of real difficulties.
I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you very much, Justin
Yeah,
Smith-Ruiu of the
yeah,
University of Paris, for joining the show.
yeah. Always nice to talk to you. Thanks, John.